pain tore through Castian's chest without warning, and he dropped to his knees in front of his entire council. The room went silent. Cups of wine froze halfway to open mouths. Guards who had never seen their Alpha King flinch now watched him grip the edge of the long stone table, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short, broken gasps. Something had struck him from the inside, like a fist closing around his ribs, like fire pouring into his blood. He had felt pain before. He had been cut, burned, and broken in battle. This was not that. This felt like his body remembered something his mind had never known. My king, Draven, his beta and oldest friend, was at his side in an instant, one hand on his shoulder, the other reaching for a blade that had no enemy to strike. What is it? Who did this? Castian could not answer right away. His vision blurred at the edges, and for a strange moment, he smelled crushed herbs and rain, though the council room was dry stone and candle smoke. He smelled a forest that was not there. He felt warmth spreading through his bones, a pull so strong, it felt like a rope had been tied around his heart and yanked toward the eastern border. The tree, he whispered, though he did not know why he said it. Something happened at the tree. Draven's face went pale. Around the table, the older council members exchanged looks heavy with old fear. Everyone in Thornvale knew the story of the border tree, though few believed it anymore. It stood at the very edge of Packland, ancient and silver-gray, its branches bare for as long as anyone alive could remember. 412 years, the old record said, since it had last bloomed. 412 years since the night the bond between an alpha and his true mate had been broken, and the tree had gone silent with grief, as if it too had lost something it loved. No one expected it to matter again. No one expected the king to feel it. Castian pushed himself up from the floor, refusing the hands that reached to steady him. He was the Alpha King. He did not fall, and he did not need help standing, but his legs shook, and the pull in his chest had not faded. If anything, it had grown sharper, more precise, like a compass needle finally finding north after spinning uselessly for years. "Clear the room," he said. The council hesitated. Draven waved them out himself, and one by one the advisors filed through the heavy doors, murmuring low to each other, throwing glances back at their king, as if he might collapse again the moment they turned their backs. When the last of them had gone, Draven closed the doors and turned to face Castian. His expression caught somewhere between concern and disbelief. "You cannot mean what I think you mean," Draven said. "I don't know what I mean." Castian pressed a hand to his chest, where the strange warmth still pulsed, slower now, but steady, like a second heartbeat that did not belong to him. "I felt something. It came from the border, from the tree. The tree hasn't bloomed in 4 centuries. Draven's voice was careful, the tone of a man trying to talk sense into someone who might not want to hear it. "It's dead wood, Castian. Everyone knows that." "Then why did I feel it die back into life?" The question hung in the air, and Draven had no answer for it. He had known Castian since they were pups running through these same halls, long before either of them carried the weight of a crown or a title. He had seen Castian face down rival packs without blinking, had seen him take a blade meant for another man's throat without so much as raising his voice. He had never seen him look the way he looked now, shaken, uncertain, almost afraid. "What do you want to do?" Draven finally asked. Castian was already moving toward the door, pulling his coat from where it hung by the window. "I want to go to the border tree myself, tonight." "You cannot walk into rival land in the middle of the night without an escort. If the tree really did bloom, that means someone touched it, someone from the other pack. If it's some kind of trick, or a trap set by our enemies, you'll be walking straight into it. Then send a scout ahead, quietly. I don't want a parade of soldiers. I don't want anyone else to know about this until I understand what it means." Castian paused at the door, his hand resting on the wood. "If this is real, Draven, if the tree has truly bloomed, then everything we know about the old bond is real too, and that changes more than either of us can guess." Draven studied him for a long moment, weighing loyalty against caution, and finally nodded. "I'll come with you. Quietly, as you say. But if this turns out to be nothing, you owe me a very good explanation for why the King of Thornvale went sneaking through the woods like a green pup chasing rumors." Despite everything, a small, tired smile crossed Castian's face. "If it's nothing, I'll buy you the finest whiskey in the kingdom, and never mention it again." "Deal," Draven said. "Now let's go find out if you've lost your mind." While the king prepared to ride toward the border under cover of darkness, many miles away, in the smaller and far less grand halls of the Duskwood Pack, a young woman named Elira had no idea that she had just changed the fate of 2 kingdoms. She hadn't meant to wander so far. She had only gone out that morning to search for silverleaf, a rare herb that grew best in shaded, undisturbed soil, the kind of soil found only near old, untouched trees. Her mentor, Corin, the pack's healer, had grown sicker over the past few weeks, his lungs rattling with a cough that no ordinary medicine seemed to touch. Elira had read every scroll in the healing hall twice over, searching for anything that might ease his suffering, and the silverleaf remedy was the only one she hadn't yet tried. The problem was that silverleaf grew best near the border, in the wild, unclaimed stretch of forest that separated Duskwood land from Thornvale land. It was a place most pack members avoided, out of old habit and older fear, a leftover caution from a war that had ended generations before Elira was even born. But Elira had never been one to follow rules simply because they were rules. She had grown up an outsider in her own pack, an orphan raised more by scrolls and herbs than by any family, and she had learned early that the world rarely handed you what you needed. Sometimes you had to go and take it yourself. She moved carefully through the trees, her basket half full of roots and leaves, her senses tuned to the small sounds of the forest around her. Birds called overhead. Somewhere nearby, a stream trickled over stone. The air smelled of moss and damp earth, familiar and calming, and for a while she almost forgot how far she had wandered from home. It was the strange quiet that finally made her stop and look up. Ahead of her, past a curtain of hanging vines, stood a tree, unlike any she had ever seen. It was massive, its trunk wide enough that 3 grown men could not have wrapped their arms around it together, and its bark was a pale, silvery gray that seemed to catch the light in an odd way, almost like it was glowing faintly from within. Its branches spread wide and bare, twisted into shapes that looked, if she tilted her head, almost like reaching hands. There were no leaves on it, no buds, nothing to suggest it was anything but dead, and yet something about it did not feel dead at all. It felt like it was waiting. Elira had never heard the legend of the border tree. Her pack did not speak of Thornvale's old stories, and even if they had, she had spent most of her childhood buried in healing texts rather than folklore. To her, this was simply the most beautiful, strange tree she had ever come across, standing alone in a clearing that seemed untouched by the rest of the forest. She set down her basket and stepped closer, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't quite explain. Up close, the tree was even more striking. Its bark was cool and smooth in some places, rough and cracked in others, and faint lines ran along its surface like veins beneath skin. She reached out without thinking, the way a person reaches to touch water to see if it's really as cold as it looks, and pressed her palm flat against the trunk. The moment her skin touched the bark, warmth spread up through her fingers, gentle and soft, like sunlight after a long winter. She felt a small flutter in her chest, quick and light, gone almost as soon as she noticed it. She thought nothing of it. She assumed it was simply the day's exhaustion, or the strange stillness of the clearing playing tricks on her senses. She stayed a moment longer, feeling an odd sense of peace settle over her, before she remembered why she had come. She pulled her hand away, gathered her basket, and continued her search for Silverleaf, unaware that behind her, deep within the ancient trunk, something that had slept for 412 years, had just begun, very slowly, to wake. By the time Elira returned to Duskwood that evening, the sky had turned a deep, bruised purple, and torches were being lit along the wooden walkways of the pack settlement. She found Corin resting in his small cabin at the edge of the healing hall, his breathing shallow but steady, and she busied herself preparing the silverleaf tincture exactly as the old scrolls described, grinding the leaves with careful precision, measuring water with practiced hands. "You went to the border again," Corin said weakly, watching her work. His eyes, though tired, were sharp as ever. "I can smell the wild forest on you." "I needed the silverleaf," Elira said simply, not looking up from her task. "The kind that grows in the clearings closer to the border is stronger. You know that as well as I do. I know it's dangerous. I know you're getting sicker every day, and I refuse to sit here doing nothing about it." Her voice was firm, though not unkind. She had cared for Corin since she was old enough to hold a mortar and pestle, and the thought of losing him terrified her more than any border legend or old pack rivalry ever could. "Drink this. It should help with the cough." Corin obeyed, though his expression remained thoughtful as he watched her over the rim of the cup. "You didn't see anything strange out there, did you? Anything unusual?" Elira paused, thinking of the tree, the odd warmth, the flutter in her chest, that had already faded from her memory like a half-remembered dream. "No," she said. "Nothing unusual. Just a very old tree." She didn't think it was worth mentioning. She had no idea that the very same evening, on the other side of that border, a king had collapsed in the middle of his own council chamber, gripping his chest and whispering about a bond no one thought could ever wake again. Castian and Draven reached the border tree well past midnight, moving quietly through unfamiliar territory, with the caution of men who understood exactly how much trouble they could cause if they were caught. The forest here was darker, thicker, the kind of quiet that made every snapped twig sound like a warning. Castian felt the pull growing stronger with every step, a warmth building behind his ribs that had nothing to do with the cool night air. When they finally stepped into the clearing, both men stopped dead in their tracks. The tree stood exactly where the old map said it would, ancient and gray, its bark catching moonlight in soft silver streaks. But it was no longer bare. Along its lowest branches, small white blossoms had opened, delicate and pale, glowing faintly, as though lit from within by something warm and alive. The blossoms were few, scattered rather than full, but they were unmistakably real, unmistakably impossible. Draven let out a slow breath. "By the old gods," he murmured, "it's true." Castian said nothing at first. He walked forward slowly, almost reverently, until he stood beneath the lowest blooming branch. He reached up and let his fingers brush against one of the pale flowers, and the pull in his chest surged, sharp and undeniable, like a hand closing gently around his heart and refusing to let go. "Someone was here," he said quietly. "Recently." He crouched down near the base of the trunk, studying the soft, frost-touched earth. There, pressed lightly into the ground, was a single footprint, small, narrow, clearly not the boot of a soldier or a hunter, a woman's print, light on her feet, careful in her movements. "Whoever it was," Castian said, rising slowly, his eyes fixed on that small mark in the frost. "She is the reason I felt what I felt tonight. She is the reason this tree woke after 412 years of silence." Draven's expression was unreadable in the dim light, torn between wonder and worry. "And what do you intend to do about that?" Castian looked back at the tree, at the pale, glowing blossoms that should not have existed, and felt the pull in his chest settle into something steadier, something that felt disturbingly like certainty. "I intend to find her," he said, "whoever she is." Neither of them spoke as they made their way back through the dark forest toward Thornvale land, but the question hung heavy between them, unanswered and impossible to ignore. Somewhere across the border, in a pack that had spent generations distrusting everything Thornvale stood for, a young woman slept peacefully, unaware that the most powerful man in the kingdom had just made it his mission to find her. She had touched a tree that hadn't bloomed in 412 years, and though she didn't know it yet, that single, simple act had already set two entire worlds on a collision course neither of them could stop. The wind moved through the newly blooming branches as Castian and Draven disappeared into the trees, and for the first time in over 4 centuries, the border tree seemed almost alive with quiet, patient hope, waiting to see what would happen next. Castian did not sleep that night. He returned to the Thornvale fortress just before dawn, his boots still damp with forest dew, his mind circling the same question over and over without finding rest. He sat alone in his private study, long after Draven had gone to catch a few hours of sleep, staring at the low fire in the hearth, as if it might offer him an answer the world had refused to give. He had ruled Thornvale for 6 years, since the death of his father, and in that time he had faced war councils, border disputes, and enemies who wanted nothing more than to see him fail. None of it had shaken him the way this had. A king was supposed to understand the shape of his own life. He was supposed to know his enemies, his allies, his path forward. Castian had always known exactly who he was, and exactly what he wanted. Tonight, for the first time, he felt like a stranger inside his own chest. pulled toward something he could not name by a force he did not choose. He thought of the footprint in the frost, small, light. A woman's. He thought of the pale blossoms glowing faintly in the dark, blooming after 412 years of silence, and he thought of the old stories his grandmother used to tell him when he was young, stories about the border tree and the bond it represented, back before those stories had faded into half-forgotten legend. The tale was simple, in the way old truths often are. Long before Castian's bloodline ruled Thornvale, an alpha and his mate had planted the tree together as a symbol of the bond between them, a bond so strong it was said to be felt not only by the two who shared it, but by the very land around them. When true mates found each other, the tree bloomed. When that bond was broken, whether by loss, betrayal, or death, the tree fell silent and bare, mourning alongside the one left behind. 412 years ago, the last alpha to feel that bond had lost his mate to a war between packs, a war whose old wounds still lingered even now, whispered about in careful tones by anyone old enough to remember why Thornvale and Duskwood had never fully trusted each other. The tree had gone silent that night, and it had stayed silent through every generation since, through every alpha who had come and gone, without ever feeling so much as a flicker of what the legends described. Until tonight. Castian rubbed a hand over his tired eyes, and rose from his chair, moving to the window that overlooked the sleeping fortress grounds. Somewhere out there, past the border, past land that had belonged to rivals for longer than anyone could remember, there was a woman who had touched an old, forgotten tree without knowing what it meant, and in doing so had reached across 4 centuries and taken hold of something inside him he hadn't known was missing. He did not know her name, he did not know her face, and yet some quiet, stubborn part of him refused to let the matter rest. By mid-morning, Draven found him still awake, staring at old maps spread across his desk, tracing the borderline with one finger, as though the parchment itself might reveal her location. "You look terrible," Draven said, dropping into the chair across from him, without waiting for permission, a habit Castian had long since stopped correcting. "I feel terrible," Castian admitted, "and also strangely certain about something I have no right to be certain about. The girl." The girl. Castian sat back, exhaling slowly. "I need to find her, Draven. Not because the legend demands it, though I suspect my council will see it that way soon enough. I need to find her, Dak, because something in me has already decided she matters, and I don't know how to make that feeling stop." Draven studied him for a long moment, weighing his next words carefully. He had watched Castian grow from a serious, guarded boy into an even more serious, more guarded man. Someone who kept his emotions locked behind careful walls, built out of duty and responsibility. He had rarely, if ever, seen Castian speak with this kind of open uncertainty. "If word of this gets out," Draven said slowly, "and it will get out. Matters like this never stay quiet for long. You understand what it will mean. The council will see the trees bloom as a sign. They'll expect you to find this woman and claim her, whether she wants to be found or not, and if she happens to be from Duskwood, which that footprint suggests she might be, you'll be stepping into land that has hated us for longer than either of us has been alive." "I know exactly what it will mean," Castian said quietly. "That's why I want to move carefully, quietly. I don't want soldiers marching to the border demanding answers. I don't want to frighten her, or force her into something before she even understands what's happening. Whoever she is, this isn't fair to her either." It was a strange thought for Castian to have, this instinct to protect a woman he had never met, but it settled over him with the same unshakable certainty as the pull itself. Whatever bond had been reawakened, he did not want their first meeting to begin with fear. "So what's your plan?" Draven asked. Castian tapped the map in front of him, his finger resting near the small border settlement closest to where they had found the tree. "Duskwood has requested a renewal of the old trade agreements for months now. My father kept putting it off out of pride, and I've done the same simply out of habit. I think it's time we finally agreed to meet." Draven raised an eyebrow. "You want to use a diplomatic visit to search for her?" "I want to use a diplomatic visit to build a bridge that should have been built years ago, and if it happens to bring me close enough to find answers about the tree, I see no reason to complain about the timing." "Castian, that's not subtle at all." "I never said it was subtle. I said it was careful." Castian allowed himself a small, tired smile. the first genuine one Draven had seen from him since the previous evening. Send word to Duskwood's Alpha. Tell him Thornvale is ready to discuss renewed trade terms, and tell him I intend to attend the negotiations myself. Draven let out a low whistle. That will cause a stir. No Thornvale king has crossed into Duskwood territory for a formal visit in over a generation. Then it's overdue, Castian said simply, though the truth of his motivation sat heavier and more personal than any trade agreement ever could. Across the border, in Duskwood, the day passed far more quietly for Illyra, though not without its own strange undercurrents. Corrin's cough had eased slightly after the silverleaf tincture, enough that he managed to sit up and eat a proper meal for the first time in days, and Illyra allowed herself a small measure of relief as she cleaned the healing hall and restocked the shelves of dried herbs. It was Nora, one of the younger healers in training, who first mentioned the strange behavior of the animals near the border. The deer haven't moved from the eastern clearing in 2 days, Nora said, setting down a basket of freshly gathered roots. And old Master Brennan says the birds near the border tree have gone quiet, completely silent, like they're waiting for something. Illyra paused in her work, a flicker of memory stirring at the mention of the border tree, though she couldn't quite place why it mattered. Waiting for what? Nora shrugged. No one knows. Master Brennan thinks it might be a sign of bad weather coming. The older folks are saying it's something else, though. Something about the old legends. What legends? Nora hesitated, glancing around as if the very topic might summon trouble simply by being spoken aloud. There's an old story about a tree at the border between us and Thornvale. Some say it used to bloom, long ago, before the war between our packs. Some say it hasn't bloomed since, and that it never will again, until an alpha finds his true mate. Illyra felt a strange chill settle over her, though she couldn't have said why. She thought of the tree she had touched 2 days before, the warmth that had spread through her fingers, the brief flutter in her chest she had dismissed so easily as exhaustion. She opened her mouth to mention it, then closed it again, uncertain, telling herself it couldn't possibly be connected. It was only an old story. Old stories were rarely more than that. It's probably nothing, Illyra said finally, though the words felt less certain than she intended them to sound. Old trees don't bloom out of nowhere after hundreds of years. There's likely a simple explanation for whatever the animals are reacting to. Nora nodded, easily convinced, and the conversation moved on to other matters, the day's tasks pulling their attention elsewhere. But Illyra found herself thinking about the tree again that evening, as she prepared for bed, staring up at the wooden beams of her small cabin, replaying the memory of that strange, gentle warmth beneath her palm. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself the flutter in her chest had simply been her own tired imagination, and that whatever was happening with the animals near the border had nothing to do with an old tree or an even older legend. She did not yet know that 400 miles east, inside a stone fortress she had never seen, a king who did not yet know her name had already begun making plans that would bring them face to face. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived at Duskwood Central Hall, carried by a Thornvale messenger under a banner of peace, requesting a meeting to renew the long-neglected trade agreements between the two packs. Duskwood's Alpha, an older, cautious man named Osric, read the letter twice, before calling his advisors together to discuss it, his expression carefully unreadable. Thornvale hasn't requested a formal meeting in over 20 years, one advisor said, voicing the doubt that hung heavy in the room. Why now? Perhaps their new king simply wants to secure his position, another suggested. Trade agreements benefit both sides equally. There's no reason to assume this is anything more than practical politics. Osric said nothing for a long moment, his eyes scanning the letter once more, lingering on the line stating that King Castian himself intended to attend the negotiations in person. It was an unusual gesture, one that suggested either genuine goodwill or something far more calculated, and Osric had lived long enough to know that the two were not always easy to tell apart. We will accept the meeting, he said finally, but we will proceed carefully. I want our best healers present, in case anything goes wrong, and I want someone I trust managing the details of the visit. His gaze drifted, almost absently, toward the healing hall in the distance, where a young woman with steady hands and a sharp mind had spent the last several years, quietly proving her worth, despite the circumstances of her birth. He did not know why her face came to mind in that moment, only that something about the timing of it all felt significant in a way he couldn't quite explain. Elira, of course, had no idea that her name had already crossed the Alpha's mind, or that within days she would be standing in the same room as the very king whose sudden, unexplainable collapse had set this entire chain of events into motion. She spent her days as she always had, tending to Corin, gathering herbs, and quietly wondering, in the back of her mind, whether that strange warmth beneath the border tree had truly been nothing at all. Somewhere between Thornvale and Duskwood, along the quiet, unclaimed stretch of forest that held the ancient tree, its pale blossoms continued to bloom a little further each day, spreading slowly along branches that had been bare for over 4 centuries, as though something patient and ancient had finally begun to remember what it felt like to hope again. The morning of the trade meeting arrived cold and clear, with a pale sun climbing slowly over the tops of the pines surrounding Duskwood's central hall. Elira woke before dawn, as she always did, and spent the early hours preparing fresh remedies for Corin, before Nora arrived to help her ready the healing hall for the day's unusual guests. "I still can't believe they're really coming," Nora said, practically bouncing with nervous energy as she arranged clean bandages and jars of salve along the shelves. "A Thornvale king, walking through our gates. My grandmother says the last time that happened, it ended in bloodshed." "That was generations ago," Elira said, though she couldn't fully shake her own quiet unease. "Times change. Alpha Osric wouldn't have agreed to the meeting if he thought it would end badly." "I suppose." Nora didn't sound convinced. "Master Brennan says we should be ready for anything, just in case. That's why he wants healers stationed near the main hall during the negotiations." Elira nodded, though her mind was only half on the conversation. She had been assigned, along with 2 other healers, to remain near the central hall throughout the day, in case any injuries or emergencies arose during the visit. It was a simple, practical task, the kind of quiet, background duty she had grown used to over the years, and she expected nothing more from it than long hours of waiting and watching from the sidelines. She had no way of knowing that fate had very different plans. By mid-morning, the Thornvale delegation arrived at Duskwood's gates, and the entire settlement seemed to hold its breath as the procession made its way through the main path. Elira, positioned near the healing station just outside the central hall, watched from a respectful distance as the visitors dismounted, her curiosity getting the better of her caution. She noticed Draven first, tall and watchful, his eyes scanning the crowd with the careful alertness of a man who trusted very little. But it was the man beside him who drew her attention and held it, though she could not immediately say why. King Castian moved with quiet, controlled authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced or performed to be felt. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair pulled back from a face that looked as though it rarely allowed itself to relax. There was something guarded in his expression, something careful and searching, as his gaze swept slowly across the gathered crowd of Duskwood pack members. And then his eyes found hers. Elira didn't understand, in that first moment, why the world seemed to tilt slightly beneath her feet. Castian's expression shifted, just barely, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face, before he schooled it back into careful neutrality. He held her gaze a moment longer than politeness required, long enough that she felt heat rise in her cheeks, and quickly looked away, embarrassed by her own reaction to a stranger she had never met. She told herself it was nothing. A king's gaze had simply passed over the crowd, and hers happened to be one of many faces it landed on briefly, before moving elsewhere. That was all. She had no reason to feel the way her heart had briefly stumbled in her chest. She did not see the way Castian's hand tightened at his side, or the way he exhaled slowly, forcing his attention back to Alpha Osric, who had stepped forward to greet him with formal, careful words. She did not know that the moment their eyes met, the pull in Castian's chest, the same pull that had brought him to his knees days earlier, had roared to life with an intensity that nearly stole the breath from his lungs. He knew, in that instant, with a certainty that defied all reason, that he had found her. The negotiations that followed passed in a blur for Castian, his mind only half engaged with the careful diplomatic language being exchanged across the long table inside the central hall. He answered questions about trade routes and resource sharing, with practiced precision, his voice steady, even as his thoughts kept drifting back to the young woman he had glimpsed near the healing station, the one whose scent, faint but unmistakable even from a distance, matched exactly the trace he had found lingering at the border tree. crushed herbs and rain. He forced himself to focus, reminding himself that revealing his suspicions too soon, in the middle of a formal negotiation between two packs with centuries of mistrust between them, would be reckless at best and disastrous at worst. He needed to be certain. He needed to speak with her, alone, before making any assumptions that could upend both their lives. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. Midway through the negotiations, one of the Duskwood advisors, an older man named Edmund, suddenly winced and pressed a hand to his side, his breath catching sharply. The room paused, attention shifting immediately toward him. "An old injury," Edmund said through gritted teeth, waving off the concern with visible discomfort. "It flares up sometimes. I'll be fine." Alpha Osric frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Someone fetch a healer." A young pack member hurried out of the hall, returning moments later with Alira close behind, her healer's bag already in hand, her expression calm and focused despite the sudden attention drawn to her. Castian watched her cross the room with quiet, practiced efficiency, kneeling beside Edmund and gently examining the source of his discomfort with careful, steady hands. "It's an old wound that never fully healed," she said after a moment, her voice clear and confident despite the room full of eyes watching her. "The cold weather is likely aggravating it. I can prepare something to ease the pain, but it will need proper treatment away from here." Osric nodded, relief clear on his face. "Thank you, Alira. See that he's cared for." Castian's chest tightened at the sound of her name. Alira. It settled into him like something he had always known, something that fit perfectly into the space that had been aching and empty since the night the tree had bloomed. As Alira helped Edmund to his feet, preparing to escort him from the hall, Castian rose from his seat as well, his voice calm and measured, despite the storm building quietly beneath his composed exterior. "Might I offer my own healer's assistance as well?" he said, addressing Osric directly, though his eyes flicked briefly, deliberately, toward Alira. "Thornvale carries certain remedies for old wounds that may not be common here. I would be glad to share the knowledge, if your healer is willing to consult." It was a thin excuse, and he knew it, but it was enough. Osric, eager to maintain goodwill during the negotiations, agreed readily, and moments later Castian found himself walking alongside Alira and Edmund toward the healing hall, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the woman beside him. Alira, for her part, felt distinctly uneasy under the weight of the king's presence, though she couldn't have explained exactly why. There was something in the way he watched her, careful and intense, that made her skin feel warm, despite the cold morning air. She busied herself with tending to Edmund's injury, grateful for the distraction, though she remained acutely aware of Castian standing nearby, silent and watchful. "You have steady hands," Castian said finally, his voice quieter now that they were away from the formal setting of the negotiation table. "And a calm way about you. Not many healers manage that under pressure." "Panic doesn't help anyone heal faster," Alira replied, focusing on her work rather than meeting his gaze. "It's a skill you learn, staying calm even when you don't feel calm inside. A wise lesson." Castian watched her hands move with practiced precision and found himself unable to look away. "How long have you served as a healer here?" "Since I was old enough to hold a mortar and pestle without dropping it," she said, a small, wry smile touching her lips despite her lingering unease. "Corin, our head healer, took me in when I had nowhere else to go. I've spent most of my life in the healing hall ever since." "He's fortunate to have you." Something about the sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and she glanced up at him briefly, before returning her attention to Edmund's wound. She told herself the flutter in her chest was simply nerves, the natural result of speaking so casually with a king she had never expected to meet, let alone stand this close to. She did not yet understand that the flutter she felt was the very same bond stirring quietly inside her, still unfamiliar and unnamed, but no less real for its silence. Once Edmund's treatment was complete, and he had been sent to rest, Alira found herself alone with Castian for the first time, the healing hall quiet around them, sunlight filtering softly through the wooden shutters. She busied herself cleaning her instruments, aware of his presence in a way that made her hands move slightly less steady than usual. "May I ask you something?" Castian said finally, his voice careful, measured, as though he were choosing each word with great caution. "Have you traveled near the eastern border recently, toward the old, unclaimed forest between our two territories?" Elira's hands stilled briefly before she resumed her cleaning, doing her best to keep her expression neutral. I gather herbs there sometimes. The soil is good for certain remedies. Why do you ask? Castian studied her for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal, torn between the instinct to protect her from a truth that might overwhelm her and the growing certainty that she deserved to know exactly what was happening between them. There's an old tree at the border, he said slowly. Ancient, gray bark, wide branches. Have you come across it? Elira's breath caught, just slightly, the memory of that strange warmth beneath her palm, rising unbidden to the surface of her thoughts. There is a tree like that, near the clearing, where I gather silverleaf. I touched it once, a few days ago. I don't know why I mentioned that. It's a strange thing to remember, but something about it felt different, peaceful somehow. Castian's expression shifted, something unguarded crossing his features before he carefully composed himself again. That tree hasn't bloomed in over 400 years, he said quietly, until 3 nights ago. Elira went very still, her mind racing to catch up with what he was suggesting, though some deep, instinctive part of her already understood. What are you saying? I'm saying that the moment you touched that tree, I felt it, Castian said, his voice low and steady despite the weight of the words. Miles away, in my own council hall, I felt something wake inside me that I didn't understand until I saw you standing near the healing station this morning. There's an old legend, Elira, about that tree, and about the bond it represents. I don't fully understand it myself, not yet, but I know what I felt, and I know it began the moment you laid your hand against that bark. Elira stared at him, torn between disbelief and a strange, quiet recognition she couldn't fully explain. The world outside the healing hall carried on as it always had, oblivious to the enormity of what had just been spoken aloud between them. But inside that small sunlit room, everything had suddenly, irrevocably changed. That's not possible, she said finally, though her voice lacked the conviction she was aiming for. I'm no one important. I have no title, no bloodline anyone would recognize. Whatever this legend of yours describes, it can't be talking about someone like me. The tree doesn't care about titles, Castian said quietly. It never has. If the old stories are true, it responds to something else entirely, something neither of us can control or explain away with logic. I wish I could tell you this makes sense to me. It doesn't. I've spent 3 days trying to convince myself I imagined the entire thing, and every time I look at you, that possibility becomes harder to believe. Elira set down the instrument she had been cleaning, her hands no longer steady enough to pretend otherwise. What exactly are you saying this means? For me? For you? Castian hesitated, choosing his words with the same careful precision he used when addressing matters of war or peace, though this felt far more delicate than either. According to the old legend, the border tree blooms when an alpha finds his true mate. The last time it happened, it was said to signal a bond so strong it could heal the wounds between packs who had spent generations distrusting one another. I don't know everything the legend claims, Elira. I only know what I've felt since the moment you touched that tree, and what I felt again the second our eyes met this morning. You're saying we're connected somehow, bonded. The word felt strange and heavy in her mouth, foreign in a way that made her chest tighten with something between fear and disbelief. I know how impossible that sounds. It sounds more than impossible, Elira said, taking a step back, putting a small but deliberate distance between them. I don't know you. I met you an hour ago. Whatever this tree is supposed to represent, I can't simply accept that my entire life has been decided by something I touched by accident while looking for herbs. I'm not asking you to accept anything, Castian said, his tone gentling, though the intensity in his eyes remained. I'm only telling you what's happening, because you deserve to know the truth, rather than being left in the dark while I quietly search for answers behind your back. I don't fully understand this bond myself. I certainly don't expect you to understand it, or welcome it, simply because I've told you it exists. His honesty caught her off guard, disarming some of her instinctive defensiveness. She studied him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of manipulation or hidden motive, and found none. Only a kind of quiet, uncertain sincerity that felt strangely at odds with the composed, powerful king she had watched command the negotiation table earlier that morning. Even if what you're saying is true, she said slowly, what happens now? You're the Alpha King of Thornvale. I'm a healer's apprentice from Duskwood. Our packs have distrusted each other for longer than either of us has been alive. This isn't as simple as a tree blooming." "No," Castian agreed. "It isn't simple at all. But I would rather face something complicated and true than pretend I felt nothing, simply because the truth is inconvenient for both our lives." Before Alira could respond, the healing hall door opened, and Draven stepped inside, his sharp eyes immediately taking in the tension hanging thick in the air between them. He said nothing about it directly, though the slight narrowing of his gaze suggested he understood exactly what he had interrupted. "Alpha Osric is requesting your presence to finalize the trade terms," Draven said, addressing Castian, though his attention lingered briefly on Alira before returning to his king. "The council is eager to conclude matters before evening." Castian nodded, though he hesitated a moment longer, his eyes returning to Alira one final time. "We'll speak again," he said quietly, a promise rather than a question. "I don't expect you to understand any of this today. But I won't pretend it isn't happening, and I hope, in time, you won't either." He left with Draven, the door closing softly behind them, and Alira remained alone in the healing hall, her thoughts spinning in directions she had never expected them to go. She sat down slowly on the edge of a wooden bench, pressing her palms against her eyes, as though she might somehow press the entire conversation back into some more manageable shape. A bond, a legend, a king who claimed her simple, accidental touch against an old tree had somehow rewritten the course of both their lives. It was, she thought, the strangest and most unsettling thing that had ever happened to her, and yet beneath the disbelief and confusion, something small and quiet inside her refused to dismiss it entirely. The trade negotiations concluded that evening with formal terms agreed upon by both alphas, terms that would, on the surface, appear to be nothing more than practical arrangements benefiting trade routes and shared resources between two long distrustful packs. But Draven, watching Castian carefully throughout the remainder of the day, understood there was far more happening beneath the surface than either pack's council realized. "You found her," Draven said quietly, once they were finally alone, riding back toward Thornvale territory, as the sun dipped low behind the trees. "The woman from the footprint. Her name is Alira," Castian said, his voice carrying a strange mixture of certainty and uncertainty at once. "She's a healer's apprentice. She touched the tree by accident, gathering herbs. She had no idea what it meant until I told her." "And how did she take that news?" Castian exhaled slowly, remembering the mixture of disbelief and quiet vulnerability in her expression. "About as well as anyone would, learning their life has suddenly been tied to a legend they've never heard of, involving a king they met only hours before." "You told her everything?" "I told her what I understood, which admittedly isn't much." Castian's jaw tightened slightly. "I won't force this on her, Draven. Whatever bond exists between us, I refuse to treat her as though she has no choice in the matter. She deserves better than being claimed simply because an old legend says she must be." Draven studied his king carefully, noting the shift in him, subtle but undeniable, since the tree had first bloomed. Castian had always been careful, controlled, prioritizing duty above personal desire in nearly every decision he made. This was different. This was a man beginning, however cautiously, to want something for himself. "The council will have questions," Draven warned. "If word spreads that the border tree has bloomed again, they'll expect answers. They'll expect you to act." "Then I'll give them careful answers, and I'll act with patience rather than haste," Castian said firmly. "This isn't a political matter to be rushed for the sake of appearances. Whatever happens between Alira and myself will happen because it's real, not because tradition demands it." Meanwhile, back in Duskwood, Alira found herself unable to focus on her usual evening tasks, her mind replaying the conversation in the healing hall over and over, searching for some logical explanation that would make the entire situation feel less overwhelming. She eventually made her way to Corin's cabin, finding him resting comfortably, his breathing far steadier than it had been in weeks. "You look troubled," Corin observed, watching her carefully as she settled into the chair beside his bed. "More troubled than usual, even for a day as strange as this one." Alira hesitated, unsure how much to share, though the weight of the secret felt too heavy to carry entirely alone. "Corin, do you know anything about the border tree? The old one, at the edge of our territory?" Corin's expression shifted, a flicker of something cautious crossing his tired features. "I know the old stories. Why do you ask? Because I touched it a few days ago, Illyra admitted quietly. And King Castian believes it bloomed because of me. He says there's some kind of bond, something about true mates, something that hasn't happened in over 400 years. Corin was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying her with a seriousness she rarely saw from him. That old legend isn't something Thornvale made up to frighten young healers. Illyra, my grandmother used to speak of it when I was a boy, back when the story was still taken seriously by both packs. If the king believes the tree has bloomed because of you, it isn't something to dismiss lightly. So it's real? All of it? I don't know everything about it, Corin admitted. Legends grow strange and uncertain with time. But if a king felt something the moment you touched that tree, and if it hasn't bloomed in 4 centuries, I would not be so quick to call it coincidence. Illyra sat back, overwhelmed by the quiet certainty in his voice, a certainty that mirrored the strange, unshakable feeling she had been trying to dismiss all day. Whatever was happening between her and the Alpha King of Thornvale, it seemed increasingly clear that it was not something either of them could simply walk away from, no matter how impossible or inconvenient the timing. Outside, beyond the walls of Duskwood, the border tree continued to bloom under the quiet cover of night, its pale blossoms multiplying slowly across its ancient branches, as though it too understood that something long dormant had finally, irreversibly begun to stir. News of the bloom did not stay contained for long. Within a week, whispers had spread through both packs, carried by traders, travelers, and the kind of quiet gossip that no border, however tense, had ever managed to fully stop. By the time the story reached Thornvale's full council and Duskwood's gathered elders, it had grown from a private, uncertain discovery into a matter both packs felt entitled to weigh in on. Castian stood before his council chamber, the same room where he had collapsed only days before, now filled with advisors whose expressions ranged from cautious curiosity to open suspicion. Draven stood at his side, arms crossed, watching the room with the same wary alertness he always carried when Castian faced anything resembling a political storm. "You mean to tell us," said one of the older council members, a stern woman named Lyanna, who had served under Castian's father before him, that the border tree has bloomed for the first time in 4 centuries, and the cause is a healer's apprentice from Duskwood. "That is correct," Castian said evenly, refusing to let the doubt in the room shake his composure. "I understand how unusual this sounds." "Unusual is a generous word for it," Lyanna replied. "The bond of the border tree, if the old stories are even accurate, was meant to unite 2 packs through marriage between ruling bloodlines. This woman has no bloodline of note. She has no political standing, no claim to leadership. If the tree responded to her, either the legend is far less specific than our ancestors believed, or something else entirely is happening here." "With respect," Castian said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that rarely failed to settle a restless room, "I did not choose this bond, and neither did she. It happened regardless of bloodlines or political convenience. I don't intend to ignore what I felt simply because it doesn't align neatly with old expectations." The room fell into uneasy murmurs, some council members exchanging doubtful glances, others watching their king with a new, cautious curiosity. It was clear that opinions on the matter were far from unified, and Castian understood, even as he stood firm, that this disagreement was unlikely to resolve quietly. Across the border, Illyra faced a similar storm within her own pack, though hers carried a sharper, more personal edge. Word had reached Duskwood's elders that their young healer's apprentice had somehow triggered the awakening of Thornvale's legendary border tree, and the reaction was far from welcoming. "You went wandering near enemy land without permission," one of the elders, a sharp-tongued woman named Talia, said accusingly, during a gathering called specifically to address the matter. "And now our entire pack is caught in the middle of some ancient Thornvale legend because of it." "I didn't wander into enemy land intentionally," Illyra said, doing her best to keep her voice steady, despite the weight of every eye in the room fixed on her. "I was gathering herbs near the border, as healers have done for years. I had no idea the tree held any significance. I certainly didn't ask for any of this to happen." "Intentional or not, the consequences remain the same," Talia pressed. "Thornvale's king now believes you are somehow bonded to him. Do you understand what that means for Duskwood? If he decides to claim you, our pack becomes entangled in Thornvale politics whether we wish it or not. And if he doesn't claim her, Alpha Osric interjected calmly, his voice carrying enough authority to quiet the room. Then perhaps this matter resolves itself naturally, without any of us needing to make hasty decisions we might later regret. Osric's calm demeanor did little to ease the tension, but it was enough to shift the conversation away from outright accusation. Still, Alira left the gathering feeling more isolated than she had in years, the weight of suspicion and doubt settling heavily over her, despite having done nothing wrong beyond reaching out to touch an old, beautiful tree. Nora found her later that evening, sitting alone near the edge of the Healing Hall garden, staring out at nothing in particular. "They shouldn't be blaming you for this," Nora said gently, settling down beside her. "None of it was your fault." "It doesn't matter whose fault it is," Alira said quietly. "It's happening regardless. I feel like I've become a problem simply by existing, simply by reaching out to touch a tree I didn't even know was significant." "For what it's worth," Nora offered, "I don't think you're a problem. I think it's strange and a little frightening, honestly, but I don't think it's your fault, and I don't think you deserve to be treated like it is." Alira offered her a small, grateful smile, though the uncertainty still weighed heavily in her chest. She thought of Castian's careful, sincere words in the healing hall, the way he had insisted he wouldn't force this bond upon her, the way his eyes had held hers with something that felt disturbingly close to genuine care, rather than political calculation. She wanted to believe him. She wasn't entirely sure she could afford to, not with an entire pack watching her every move with suspicion. Meanwhile, within Thornvale's fortress, Castian found himself facing pressure from an unexpected direction. A faction within his own council, quiet but persistent, began raising concerns not about whether the bond was real, but about what it might mean for the balance of power between the two packs, should it be allowed to solidify. "If this bond is genuine," said a younger council member named Rowan, someone Castian had always considered loyal, though rarely outspoken, "it will inevitably draw Duskwood closer to Thornvale's influence. Some among us remember the war that cost us so much, generations ago. Not everyone will welcome a peace built on something as uncertain as an old legend. Are you suggesting I should ignore what's happening simply to avoid stirring old grudges?" Castian asked, his tone carefully controlled despite the frustration simmering beneath it. "I'm suggesting caution, my king. Nothing more." Rowan's expression remained carefully neutral, though something in his tone left Castian faintly uneasy. "Not everyone in this room, or beyond it, will see this bond as a blessing. Some may see it as a threat to old boundaries that have kept us safe for generations." Castian dismissed the council shortly after, Rowan's words lingering uncomfortably in his mind long after the room had emptied. He trusted his council, mostly, but he had learned long ago that trust required constant, careful attention, and Rowan's tone had carried an edge he couldn't quite dismiss as simple caution. That evening, unable to shake the unease building steadily within him, Castian made the decision to return to the border tree alone, drawn once again by the same quiet, insistent pull that had first brought him there. He found the tree in fuller bloom than before, its pale blossoms now spread generously across nearly every branch, glowing faintly in the moonlight, like scattered stars caught among gray, ancient wood. He stood beneath it for a long while, simply breathing in the quiet stillness of the clearing, trying to make sense of the growing complications surrounding something that had, at its core, felt so simple and undeniable the moment he first understood it. A bond, a pull toward someone who made the constant weight of leadership feel, for a few brief moments, lighter than it had in years. He did not know, as he stood there beneath the blossoming branches, that similar unease was beginning to stir on the other side of the border, or that the same quiet, persistent tension, building within his own council, had begun to take root within Duskwood's leadership as well, fueled by old fears neither Castian nor Alira had any part in creating, but which both of them would soon be forced to face together. The wind shifted through the branches above him, scattering a few pale petals into the cool night air, and Castian found himself hoping, with a sincerity that surprised him, that whatever difficulties lay ahead, they would not be enough to undo something that had already begun to feel, against all odds, like it might be worth protecting. 10 days after the trade negotiations concluded, Alpha Osric received an unusual request from Thornvale, one that raised eyebrows throughout Duskwood's council chamber the moment it was read aloud. King Castian was requesting a second visit, this time framed as a continuation of trade discussions, though everyone present understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the true purpose ran far deeper than commerce. He wants to see her again, Talia said flatly, her disapproval evident despite her attempt to keep her tone measured. This has nothing to do with trade routes. Whether it does or doesn't, Osric replied calmly. Refusing the request would only invite further suspicion, and possibly offense, at a time when maintaining peace between our packs matters more than ever. We will allow the visit. Elira learned of the king's return the same afternoon, the news delivered by Nora with poorly concealed excitement, despite the tension still lingering from the previous gathering. Elira felt her stomach twist into something complicated, equal parts anxiety, and, though she was reluctant to admit it even to herself, quiet anticipation. In the days since their first meeting, she had found herself thinking of Castian more often than she wanted to, replaying their conversation in the healing hall, wondering about the strange, steady warmth she had felt beneath her palm against the tree's bark. She told herself repeatedly that it meant nothing, that a single conversation and an old legend were not enough to build anything real between two people, from packs with centuries of distrust behind them. And yet some quiet, persistent part of her continued to wonder. When Castian arrived at Duskwood 2 days later, the greeting was noticeably less formal than before, though no less carefully watched by both packs' leadership. Elira found herself once again assigned to the healing station near the central hall, though this time she suspected, with a flicker of wry amusement, that the assignment had less to do with practical necessity and more to do with Osric's own quiet curiosity about how the situation might unfold. Castian sought her out almost immediately, his expression carrying the same careful restraint she remembered from their previous meeting, though something in his eyes seemed softer now, less guarded. "I wasn't certain you would agree to speak with me again," he admitted, once they had found a quiet corner away from the watchful eyes of both delegations. "I wasn't certain I wanted to," Elira replied honestly, though there was no real sharpness behind the words. "But avoiding you doesn't seem to make any of this less complicated. I thought perhaps understanding it better might help." "That seems fair." Castian allowed himself a small, genuine smile, the first she had seen from him. "What would you like to understand?" Elira considered the question carefully, choosing her words with the same deliberate care she used when measuring herbs for a delicate remedy. Everyone keeps speaking about this bond as though it's already decided, as though the tree, blooming, means our lives are now bound together whether we want them to be or not. I want to understand what choice, if any, either of us actually has in this. I've asked myself the same question many times since the tree first bloomed, Castian admitted. From what little I understand of the old legend, the bond marks a connection, a possibility, rather than a decision already made. It doesn't force either of us into anything. It simply reveals that something exists between us, something rare enough that it hasn't happened in over 4 centuries. What we choose to do with that revelation is, as far as I understand it, entirely up to us. And if I choose that I don't want this bond? What happens then? Castian's expression remained steady, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, something that looked almost like quiet vulnerability. Then I would accept that choice, difficult as it might be, and I would not pursue this further against your wishes. I meant what I said before, Elira. I won't force you into a bond simply because an old tree responded to your touch. Whatever happens between us needs to be something we both choose, not something decided for us by legend or circumstance. His sincerity settled something uneasy within her, though it did little to fully ease the complicated tangle of emotions she had been carrying since their first conversation. She studied him carefully, searching once again for any trace of calculation or hidden motive, and found instead only quiet, steady honesty. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked finally. "You're a king. You could easily dismiss this entire situation as an inconvenient legend and move forward with your life, exactly as it was before. Why pursue it at all?" Castian considered the question for a long moment before answering, his voice quieter, more contemplative than she had yet heard it. "Because for the first time since I became king, something happened that had nothing to do with duty or expectation, or the endless calculations of leadership. Something simply happened, quietly and completely outside my control, and rather than feeling burdened by it, I felt something closer to hope. I haven't felt that in a long while, Elira. I'm not eager to dismiss it simply because it's inconvenient." His words settled over her with unexpected weight, and for the first time since the entire situation had begun, Elira allowed herself to consider, if only briefly, that whatever this bond represented, it might not be something to fear as thoroughly as she had assumed. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps, and both turned to see Nora approaching quickly, her expression tense with concern. "Elira, Corin has taken a turn for the worse. His breathing has become difficult again, worse than before." All the careful composure Elira had maintained throughout the conversation dissolved instantly into focused urgency. "I need to go to him." "Let me help," Castian said immediately, falling into step beside her without hesitation. "You don't need to." "I want to," he interrupted gently. "Please, let me help if I can." Elira didn't have time to argue, her focus already shifting entirely toward Corin's well-being as they hurried toward the healing hall. They found him struggling for breath, his face pale, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored movements that sent a fresh wave of fear through Elira's chest. "The silverleaf tincture isn't enough anymore," she said, her hands already moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed him, though her voice carried an edge of desperation she couldn't fully hide. "His lungs are struggling. I need something stronger, something I don't have on hand." "Thornvale's healers carry a remedy for exactly this kind of ailment," Castian said quickly. "A root extract, rare but effective, used for severe lung ailments. I can have it brought here within the hour if you're willing to try it." Elira hesitated only a moment before nodding, trusting the urgency in his voice over any lingering uncertainty about accepting help from Thornvale. Castian moved immediately, calling for Draven and dispatching a rider back toward Thornvale with careful, precise instructions, while Elira remained at Corin's side, doing everything within her limited power to ease his breathing until the remedy arrived. The hour that followed felt endless, filled with quiet, desperate care, as Elira monitored Corin's condition, her hands steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. Castian stayed beside her throughout, offering quiet support, fetching water, holding supplies steady, doing whatever small tasks she needed without being asked. His presence a steady, calming constant amid the crisis. When the rider finally returned with the requested remedy, Elira prepared it with careful precision, administering it to Corin with hands that trembled only slightly, despite her best efforts to remain composed. Slowly, gradually, Corin's breathing began to ease, the tight, labored gasps softening into something steadier, more manageable. Relief washed over Elira so completely that her knees nearly buckled, and without fully thinking about it, she found herself leaning briefly against Castian's steady presence beside her, grateful beyond words for his help. "Thank you," she whispered, once Corin had drifted into a calmer, more restful sleep. "I don't know what I would have done without that remedy." "I'm glad I could help," Castian said softly, and something in the quiet sincerity of his voice, combined with the exhausting emotional weight of the past hour, settled a new kind of understanding, deep within her chest. Whatever complicated, uncertain future lay ahead for the two of them, she realized. Watching him carefully in the dim light of the healing hall, she no longer felt entirely afraid of it. Somewhere amid the crisis and the quiet relief that followed, something between them had shifted, gently but unmistakably, into something that felt, for the first time, less like an ancient legend forced upon them, and more like a choice she might actually be willing to make. Word of how the Thornvale King had helped save Duskwood's head healer spread quickly through the settlement, softening some of the suspicion that had followed Elira since the news of the bond first broke. Not everyone's doubts eased, but enough shifted that Osric found himself facing fewer objections when he agreed to a third, less formal visit between the two of them, this time framed openly as an opportunity for the bonded pair to properly understand what their connection might mean for both packs. Over the following weeks, Castian's visits to Duskwood became a quiet, steady rhythm, each one bringing him and Elira a little closer, their conversations shifting gradually from cautious formality into something warmer and more genuine. He learned about her childhood, about the years spent studying healing texts late into the night, about the quiet loneliness of growing up without parents, in a pack that had never quite known what to do with her. She learned about the weight he carried as king, about the father he had lost too young, about the constant, careful balancing act of leading a pack that expected strength above all else, even when strength wasn't always what the moment required. Illyra found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, looking forward to his visits, the easy warmth of his company chipping away, little by little, at the walls of caution she had built around herself since childhood. Castian, in turn, found himself drawn to the quiet steadiness of her presence, the way she listened carefully before speaking, the gentle humor that emerged once she felt comfortable enough to let her guard down. Neither of them spoke openly of romance, not at first, both too cautious of the weight already placed upon their connection, by legend and politics alike. But the growing warmth between them was impossible to ignore, evident in the way their conversations lingered longer than necessary, the way Castian found excuses to extend his visits, the way Illyra found herself smiling more easily whenever he was near. It was during one such visit, weeks after their first meeting, that Castian finally suggested they return to the border tree together, the place where everything between them had first, quietly begun. They walked the familiar path in comfortable silence, the late afternoon sun casting soft golden light through the trees, and when they finally reached the clearing, both of them paused, struck once again by the tree's transformation. What had once been bare, gray branches were now fully covered in delicate white blossoms, the tree's ancient trunk practically glowing with soft, warm light beneath the canopy above. "It's beautiful," Illyra said quietly, stepping closer, reaching out to gently touch one of the pale flowers. "It reminds me, every time I see it, just how strange and unexpected all of this has been," Castian said, watching her with quiet affection he no longer bothered trying to hide. "I never imagined finding something like this. Not the tree, not the bond, not you." Illyra turned to look at him, her expression soft, thoughtful. "I never imagined it either. I spent most of my life believing I would remain exactly what I always was, an orphan healer, with no particular importance to anyone beyond the walls of the healing hall. This," she gestured between them, "was never part of any future I imagined for myself." "Is that a bad thing?" Castian asked carefully, watching her closely. Illyra considered the question honestly, searching her own heart for the truth of her answer. "No," she said finally, a small genuine smile crossing her face. "I don't think it is. Frightening certainly, complicated, without question, but not bad." Castian felt something loosen in his chest at her words, a tension he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying since the very beginning of their strange, unlikely journey together. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his, the same warmth she remembered from touching the tree spreading now between their joined palms, steady and undeniable. "I care for you, Illyra," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the careful political restraint she had grown used to hearing from him. "Not because of the tree, not because of the bond or the legend or any of the expectations placed upon us. I care for you because of who you are, the person I've come to know over these past weeks. Whatever choice you make about this bond, I wanted you to know that." Illyra felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, moved by the quiet sincerity in his voice. "I care for you too," she admitted softly. "More than I expected to, and more than I probably should, given everything still standing between our two packs." They stood together beneath the blossoming branches, the weight of everything still unresolved between their packs, momentarily forgotten in the quiet warmth of the moment, and for the first time since the tree had first bloomed, both of them allowed themselves to simply feel, without hesitation or fear, the truth of what had grown steadily between them. It was, unfortunately, a peace that would not last uninterrupted. News of their growing closeness reached both packs quickly, and while many welcomed the possibility of genuine peace built on something as rare and meaningful as the border tree's bond, others viewed the development with renewed suspicion and, in certain quiet corners of both settlements, outright hostility. Within Thornvale, Rowan's earlier caution had shifted into something more deliberate, quiet conversations, held late into the night, with a small handful of council members, who shared his unease about growing too close to a pack their ancestors had once fought against. Within Duskwood, similar quiet gatherings took place among Talia and a few older elders who feared the growing bond might slowly erode their pack's independence, drawing them ever more firmly under Thornvale's influence. Neither Castian nor Illyra were fully aware, in those early hopeful weeks, of how deeply this quiet unrest had begun to take root, or how far certain individuals within their own ranks were willing to go to prevent the bond from fully solidifying. The first true, undeniable sign of danger arrived nearly a month after their moment beneath the blossoming tree, delivered not through open conflict, but through a quiet, carefully worded warning that reached Draven late one evening, brought by a Thornvale scout who had overheard troubling conversation among a small faction gathering near the border. "They're planning something," the scout reported, his voice low with genuine concern. "I couldn't hear everything clearly, but I heard mention of the tree, and of ensuring the bond never fully takes hold. I believe they intend to act before the next visit between the king and the Duskwood healer." Draven's expression darkened considerably as he absorbed the warning, understanding immediately the seriousness of what he had just been told. He moved quickly to inform Castian, finding him in his private study, reviewing correspondence related to the ongoing peace efforts between the two packs. "We have a problem," Draven said grimly, closing the door behind him. "A serious one." Castian looked up sharply, immediately sensing the weight behind his old friend's tone. "Tell me." As Draven relayed the scout's warning, Castian's expression shifted from confusion to grim, focused clarity, the quiet peace of the past weeks, giving way once again to the familiar, careful calculation of a leader facing genuine threat. Whatever hope had begun to bloom between himself and Alira, it seemed, was about to be tested in a way neither of them could have anticipated when they first stood together beneath the border tree's fragile, blossoming branches. "We need to warn her," Castian said immediately, already moving toward the door. "Tonight, if possible. If there's any danger to Alira, I won't wait until morning to address it." Draven nodded grimly, falling into step beside him. "I'll gather a small, trusted escort. Quietly, as before. We can't afford for word of this to spread further until we understand exactly what we're facing." As the two men prepared to ride once again toward the border under cover of darkness, the peaceful, hopeful moment they had shared beneath the blossoming tree felt, for the first time, dangerously fragile, threatened by forces neither of them had fully anticipated when their strange, unlikely bond had first begun. Alira was still awake when the messenger arrived at Duskwood's gates well past midnight, requesting an urgent audience on behalf of the Thornvale king. She met Castian in the quiet, dimly lit healing hall, his expression tense in a way she had never seen before, Draven standing watchful and alert just behind him. "What's happened?" she asked immediately, her healer's instincts sensing crisis before he had even spoken a word. "We received word tonight of a faction within my own council, who oppose our bond strongly enough that they may be planning something against it," Castian said, his voice carrying none of its usual careful composure. "I don't yet know exactly what they intend, but the warning was serious enough that I couldn't wait until morning to bring it to you." Alira felt a cold chill settle over her, the peaceful weeks of growing closeness suddenly feeling painfully fragile in the face of this new, unwelcome threat. "What kind of danger are we talking about?" "I don't know yet," Castian admitted honestly, "but I intend to find out, and I won't allow anything to happen to you while I do." Over the following days, both packs quietly increased security along the border, though the added caution did little to fully ease the growing tension building beneath the surface. Draven's careful investigation slowly uncovered more details about the faction's intentions, revealing a plan that had grown far more serious than either Castian or Alira had initially feared. Rowan, it turned out, had been coordinating secretly not only with sympathetic voices within Thornvale's council, but with a small, similarly unhappy faction within Duskwood as well. Individuals who shared his belief that the growing bond between their king and Duskwood's healer threatened old boundaries they were unwilling to see dissolved. Their plan, as Draven eventually uncovered through careful, patient investigation, involved striking at the border tree itself, destroying the ancient bloom, in an attempt to sever whatever mysterious connection it represented, before the bond could fully solidify between Castian and Alira. "They believe destroying the tree will break the bond," Draven explained grimly, once his investigation had finally uncovered enough detail to understand the full scope of the plot. "Whether that's true or not, I have no idea. But they're clearly desperate enough to try." "When do they intend to act?" Castian asked, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. "Soon. Possibly within days. They're waiting for an opportunity, when security along the border is lightest." Castian's mind raced through the implications, the danger not only to the tree itself, but to Alira, who frequently visited that same clearing, and to the fragile, hard-won peace beginning to grow between their two packs. "We need to increase protection around the tree immediately, and we need to warn Alira properly. Make sure she understands the full extent of the danger." Alira, upon learning the full details of the plot, felt a surge of anger cut through her fear, indignant that anyone would seek to destroy something as beautiful and meaningful as the tree, simply out of old, stubborn prejudice. "This isn't just about the bond anymore," she said firmly, once Castian had explained everything Draven's investigation had uncovered. "This is about people so afraid of change that they're willing to destroy something ancient and irreplaceable just to avoid it." "I won't let that happen," Castian said, his voice carrying quiet, unwavering determination. "Not to the tree, and certainly not to you." Despite their increased caution, the attack came sooner than expected, catching both packs partially unprepared, despite their heightened vigilance. It happened on a quiet evening, nearly a week after the initial warning, when Alira, drawn by habit and a persistent, quiet worry for the tree's safety, made her way once again toward the border clearing, accompanied only by Nora and a small, informal escort. She sensed something wrong the moment they approached the clearing, an unnatural stillness hanging heavy in the air, the usual quiet sounds of the forest conspicuously absent. Nora noticed it too, her steps slowing, her expression tightening with sudden unease. "Something's not right," Nora whispered. Before Alira could respond, movement flickered at the edge of the clearing, and several figures emerged from the shadows, their intentions unmistakably hostile. Alira's escort moved quickly to position themselves protectively, but they were outnumbered, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of Rowan's faction, armed and clearly prepared for confrontation. "Get back," Alira urged Nora, quietly, pushing her gently behind her, her mind racing through options, even as fear tightened uncomfortably in her chest. Rowan stepped forward from among the group, his expression carrying none of the careful, measured caution Castian had described from council meetings. Here, in the shadowed clearing, his true intentions were laid bare, cold and determined. "This ends tonight," Rowan said, his voice carrying grim finality. "The tree, the bond, all of it, before it drags both our packs into a future none of us asked for." "You're making a mistake," Alira said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear pounding through her veins. "Destroying the tree won't undo whatever's already happened between Castian and myself. It will only cause needless harm." "Perhaps," Rowan replied coldly. "But it will remove the symbol, and symbols matter more than you realize." Before further words could be exchanged, the sound of approaching horses cut through the tense silence, and moments later, Castian and Draven burst into the clearing, having been alerted just in time by a border guard who had noticed the suspicious movement. Castian's expression shifted instantly from urgency to fury the moment he took in the scene before him. Alira surrounded, clearly in danger. Rowan standing at the center of it all with unmistakable hostile intent. "Rowan," Castian said, his voice dangerously low as he dismounted quickly, positioning himself protectively near Alira, despite the clear danger surrounding them. "Stand down. Now." "I can't do that, my king," Rowan replied, though something in his voice wavered slightly under the weight of Castian's unwavering authority. "This bond threatens everything our ancestors fought to protect. I won't stand by and watch it destroy the boundaries that have kept us safe. The only thing threatening our safety right now," Castian said sharply, "is you, standing in this clearing threatening an innocent woman, over a legend you clearly don't fully understand." The tension in the clearing stretched taut, dangerous and uncertain, both sides watching each other carefully, waiting to see who might move first. Alira, despite her fear, found herself thinking quickly, her healer's instincts recognizing an opportunity even amid the danger surrounding them. "Wait," she said suddenly, stepping forward slightly despite Castian's protective instinct to pull her back. "Before anyone does anything they can't undo, let me ask you something, Rowan. Do you truly believe destroying this tree will erase whatever bond exists between Castian and myself? Or do you simply fear what that bond represents, the possibility of real, lasting peace between packs you've been taught your whole life to distrust?" Rowan hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her directness, his conviction wavering slightly under the weight of her calm, steady question. "It doesn't matter what I believe," he said finally, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "What matters is protecting our people from a future none of us can control." "You're not protecting anyone," Alira said firmly. "You're simply afraid, and fear has driven far too many terrible decisions throughout history. If you truly cared about protecting your people, you would give peace an honest chance, rather than destroying it before it's even had the opportunity to prove itself. Her words hung heavy in the clearing, and for a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, unexpectedly, one of Rowan's own followers, a younger Thornvale soldier who had joined the faction more out of loyalty to Rowan than genuine conviction, lowered his weapon slightly, uncertainty clear on his face. It was enough to shift the fragile balance of the standoff. Draven moved quickly, using the moment's hesitation to disarm the nearest threat, while Castian positioned himself firmly between Alira and Rowan, refusing to allow any further advance. The remaining members of Rowan's faction, sensing the crumbling resolve among their own ranks, hesitated, their earlier certainty faltering under the combined weight of Castian's unwavering authority and Alira's calm, unflinching words. Rowan, finally recognizing the collapse of his plan, lowered his own weapon slowly, defeat, and something like genuine uncertainty crossing his features. "This isn't over," he said quietly, though the conviction had noticeably drained from his voice. "The tension between our packs runs deeper than one bond can heal." "Perhaps," Castian said evenly, though his tone carried no room for further argument. "But it won't be resolved through violence, and it certainly won't be resolved tonight. Stand down, Rowan. This ends now." Slowly, reluctantly, Rowan's faction lowered their weapons fully, and Draven moved quickly to secure them, ensuring no further danger remained in the clearing. As the tension finally began to ease, Castian turned immediately to Alira, his earlier fury giving way to open, unguarded relief. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his hands gently checking for any sign of injury, despite her reassuring shake of her head. "I'm fine," she said softly, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "Thanks to you, and to some very well-timed words, apparently." Castian let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, pulling her gently into a careful, relieved embrace, uncaring for the moment about the watching eyes of soldiers and captured conspirators alike. "I should never have let you come here without proper protection," he murmured. "I'm sorry." "You couldn't have known," Alira said gently, though she allowed herself to lean into his embrace, grateful beyond words for his timely arrival. "But I'm glad you came." Above them, illuminated softly by moonlight, the border tree stood untouched, its delicate white blossoms swaying gently in the cool night breeze, having survived the very threat that had sought to destroy it, standing now as an even stronger symbol of the fragile, hard-won peace that Castian and Alira had fought so unexpectedly hard to protect. In the days that followed, news of the failed attack spread quickly through both packs, and rather than deepening old suspicions, it seemed instead to shift something meaningful in the way both Thornvale and Duskwood viewed the growing bond between their king and their healer. Rowan and his fellow conspirators were brought before both packs' leadership, their actions condemned firmly by alphas and councils alike, and the swift, unified response served as a clear signal that neither pack intended to let old fear dictate their future any longer. "You could have been killed," Draven said quietly to Castian, once the immediate aftermath had settled and the captured conspirators had been dealt with according to Thornvale's laws. "Both of you." "I know," Castian admitted, his gaze drifting toward Alira, who stood nearby speaking gently with Nora, still visibly shaken, but steady despite everything she had just faced. "But I also know that if I had hesitated, if I had let fear stop me from protecting what matters, I would have lost something far more valuable than my own safety." Draven studied his king for a long moment, noting the quiet certainty in his voice, so different from the careful, guarded man he had known before the border tree first bloomed. "You've changed, you know, since all of this began." "Perhaps I have," Castian said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips, as he watched Alira laugh softly at something Nora said, the warmth of her presence easing something tired and heavy within his chest. "I think, for the first time in a long while, that might be a good thing." Within Duskwood, similar conversations unfolded among the pack's leadership, Talia and several other elders forced to confront the reality that their earlier suspicion had nearly cost lives, nearly destroyed something rare and meaningful, simply out of stubborn fear of change. "I owe you an apology," Talia said to Alira several days later, finding her alone in the healing hall, tending quietly to Corin, whose health continued to improve steadily, thanks to the ongoing exchange of remedies between the two packs. "I judged you unfairly from the beginning, blamed you for something that was never your fault. I understand why you were afraid, Alira said gently, setting aside her work to give the older woman her full attention. Change is frightening, especially when it involves old wounds that never fully healed. I don't hold it against you. Talia studied her for a long moment, something like genuine respect crossing her weathered features. You're a better person than most would be, given the circumstances. Duskwood is fortunate to have you, Alira, whatever bond exists between you and Thornvale's king. The weeks following the attack brought a quiet, steady healing between both packs, old wounds beginning, slowly and carefully, to close in ways that would have seemed impossible only months before. Trade flourished under the renewed agreements. Healers from both settlements began sharing knowledge and remedies more openly, and the deep, generational distrust that had defined the relationship between Thornvale and Duskwood for centuries began, gradually, to soften into something resembling genuine cooperation. Through it all, Castian and Alira's bond continued to grow, deepened rather than diminished by the danger they had faced together. Their visits, once carefully arranged diplomatic occasions, became simply time spent together, walking through Duskwood's gardens, sitting quietly in the healing hall, while Alira worked, or returning, often, to the border tree that had first brought them together. It was during one such visit, nearly 2 months after the attack, that Castian finally gathered the courage to voice something he had been quietly considering since the very night Alira had first stood between him and Rowan's threats, calm and unflinching despite her fear. They stood together beneath the border tree, now in full, glorious bloom, its branches heavy with delicate white blossoms that seemed to glow softly, even in daylight, the entire clearing filled with a quiet, peaceful warmth that felt, to both of them, like home. Alira, Castian said quietly, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had rarely seen from him, even in their most private moments together. I've spent my entire life believing that duty and personal happiness were separate things, that a king couldn't afford to want anything simply for himself. You've changed that belief entirely. Being with you doesn't feel like a duty, or a legend, or an obligation placed upon me by an old, ancient tree. It feels like the truest choice I've ever made. Alira felt her breath catch, sensing the weight building behind his words, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and quiet joy. I care for you, Castian continued, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly evident beneath it, not because the tree bloomed, not because some old legend decided our fates before we ever met. I care for you because of your strength, your kindness, the calm courage you showed, even when facing genuine danger. Whatever this bond represents, I no longer see it as something that chose for us. I see it as something that revealed what was already true, that we were meant to find each other, and that everything since has simply been us choosing, again and again, to hold on to that truth. He reached for her hands, holding them gently within his own, the familiar warmth between them steady and reassuring. I want to choose you, Alira. Not because of prophecy or legend, but because you are the person I want beside me, in leadership and in life, if you'll have me. Tears gathered in Alira's eyes, though they carried none of the fear or uncertainty that had once accompanied thoughts of this bond. I've spent my whole life believing I would never truly belong anywhere, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. You've shown me that belonging isn't about bloodlines or titles or old expectations. It's about choosing each other, again and again, even when it's difficult, even when the world around us tries to convince us it shouldn't work. She smiled through her tears, squeezing his hands gently. I choose you too, Castian. Not because of the tree, and not because of legend, because of who you are, and who I've become since meeting you. Beneath the softly glowing blossoms of the ancient border tree, Castian pulled her gently into his arms, and for the first time since the tree had first bloomed, after 412 years of silence, both of them allowed themselves to simply be present in the quiet, hopeful joy of the moment, free from doubt, free from fear, held together by something that had proven, through every test and challenge, to be entirely, unmistakably real. News of Castian's intention to formally claim Alira as his mate spread quickly through both packs, and this time, rather than suspicion or fear, the announcement was met largely with quiet, hopeful celebration. The events of the past months, the failed attack, the swift unified response from both packs' leadership, the The steady growth of trust and cooperation between Thornvale and Duskwood had done more to prove the value of their bond than any old legend ever could have. Alpha Osric, standing before Duskwood's gathered pack the day the formal announcement was made, spoke with quiet pride about the young healer he had watched grow from a quiet, overlooked orphan into someone capable of steadying an entire negotiation, of standing calm and unshaken before genuine danger, of earning the respect and affection of a king without ever once losing sight of who she truly was. Alira has never needed a bond or a legend to prove her worth to this pack, Osric said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. She has proven it herself, time and again, through her care for our people and her courage in the face of danger. That she has also found genuine happiness and helped forge a lasting peace between our packs in the process is simply further proof of the remarkable person she has always been. Castian, addressing his own council and pack shortly after, spoke with similar conviction, making clear that his choice to claim Alira had nothing to do with old expectation or political convenience, and everything to do with the genuine bond they had built together, tested and proven through hardship rather than simply granted by legend. 412 years ago, Castian said, standing before Thornvale's gathered council and pack members, our border tree fell silent, mourning a bond broken by war and loss. Today, it blooms again, not simply because of an old legend, but because two people, from two packs long divided by fear and old grievance, chose to build something new together, despite every obstacle placed before them. That is the true meaning of this bond, and it is a meaning I intend to honor for the rest of my life. The formal ceremony took place several weeks later, held beneath the border tree itself, its branches now heavy with blossoms that seemed, if such a thing were possible, even more vibrant and alive than before. Members from both Thornvale and Duskwood gathered together in the clearing, an occasion that would have seemed impossible only a year earlier, standing united in quiet celebration of the bond that had brought their long-divided packs together. Alira stood beneath the softly glowing branches, dressed simply but beautifully, her hands steady in Castian's, as they exchanged the quiet, meaningful words that would formally bind their lives together, not as a king and a symbol of an old prophecy, but as two people who had chosen each other, deliberately and completely, through every difficulty life had placed before them. Corin, fully recovered thanks to the continued exchange of healing knowledge between the two packs, stood proudly among the gathered crowd, watching the young woman he had raised as his own, with quiet, overwhelming pride. Nora stood nearby, tears of joy streaming freely down her face, while even Talia, once so quick to judge, watched the ceremony with genuine warmth, her earlier suspicion long since replaced by quiet respect and gratitude for the peace Alira and Castian's bond had helped bring to both their peoples. Draven, standing at Castian's side as he always had, felt a quiet, deep satisfaction, watching his king, his oldest friend, finally allow himself the simple, genuine happiness that duty had so long kept just out of reach. As the ceremony concluded and the gathered crowd began their quiet celebration beneath the blossoming branches, Castian and Alira stepped away for a private moment, standing together at the base of the ancient tree that had first brought their unlikely story together. 412 years, Alira said softly, resting her hand gently against the tree's smooth, warm bark. It's strange to think that all of this began simply because I reached out to touch an old tree while searching for herbs. I've thought about that many times, Castian admitted, wrapping his arm gently around her waist as they both gazed up at the softly glowing blossoms above them. How something so small, so simple, could change everything so completely. Perhaps that's the true lesson in all of this, Alira said thoughtfully. That the smallest, most unexpected moments often carry the greatest potential for change, if we're brave enough to embrace them rather than fear them. Castian smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head as the sound of celebration continued softly around them, the quiet joy of both packs united, finally, in genuine, lasting peace. I'm endlessly grateful you were brave enough, that day at the border, to reach out and touch something you didn't yet understand. And I'm grateful you were brave enough to follow that pull, all the way to Duskwood, and to keep choosing me, again and again, through every difficulty that followed. Above them, the ancient border tree stood in full, glorious bloom, its delicate white blossoms swaying gently in the warm afternoon breeze, no longer a silent symbol of grief and loss, but a living testament to the bond that had finally, after 412 long years, been allowed to bloom again. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting warm golden light across the clearing, where Thornvale and Duskwood now stood united, rather than divided, Castian and Alira remained beneath the blossoming branches, hand in hand, their story no longer one of ancient legend or old prophecy, but simply, beautifully, their own, built through courage, choice, and a love that had proven strong enough to heal wounds centuries in the making. The border tree had waited 412 years to bloom again, patient and silent through generations of loss and distance. But some things, it seemed, were worth the wait, and as its pale blossoms continued to glow softly beneath the setting sun, it stood now not as a reminder of what had once been broken, but as a promise of everything that could still be healed, one brave, unexpected choice at a time.